Reality was never a permanent structure. It was a temporary agreement, a shared operating system formed by biology, physics, and survival pressure. For most of human history, that agreement felt immovable because there was no alternative interface. You were born into a body, embedded in matter, constrained by distance, decay, and irreversible time. Reality did not need belief or validation. It enforced itself through consequence. But agreements only remain stable while exit is impossible. The moment humanity began developing tools capable of simulating environments, abstracting identity, and decoupling experience from physical limitation, reality lost its monopoly. It stopped being an unquestioned condition and became a selectable state. Something you inhabit rather than something you obey. Reality did not fail. It simply stopped being mandatory. And once reality becomes optional, its authority weakens even if nothing about it actually changes. A system stops being a default the moment a substitute becomes viable. For most of history, physical reality was not chosen, it was inherited. It was the only environment capable of supporting memory, labor, social structure, and continuity. There was nowhere else for human life to occur, so reality never had to compete. It simply existed, and everything else conformed to it. That condition is ending. Digital environments now exceed physical reality in speed, scale, and adaptability. They do not degrade with time. They do not resist intention. Space can be expanded instantly. Physics can be rewritten. Time can be slowed, accelerated, or paused altogether. Presence becomes a technical problem rather than a geographic one. At first, these environments supplement reality. They handle communication, planning, simulation, and abstraction. Then, they begin absorbing functions that once required physical presence. Work migrates. Creativity migrates. Social bonds migrate. Memory itself migrates. Reality does not disappear. It simply stops being where life primarily happens. Physical reality ties consciousness to location. To be aware has always meant being somewhere specific, at a specific moment, inside a specific body. Presence required proximity. Experience required arrival. Distance imposed delay, separation, and consequence. Life after reality breaks that connection. When presence is defined by signal rather than position, location stops functioning as a governing force. Distance collapses into latency. Consciousness no longer travels through space. It is instantiated wherever systems allow it to run. You do not go somewhere. You render there. Experience becomes independent of geography. Awareness can shift between environments instantly, without movement, without transition, without the friction that once defined travel. The idea of here and there loses narrative weight. What matters is not where you are, but which environment is currently hosting your attention. The body becomes optional infrastructure rather than a mandatory anchor. You are no longer present because you occupy space. You are present because a system is sustaining your awareness. And once consciousness is no longer bound to place, reality loses one of its oldest organizing principles. Biological reality enforces a single continuous self, one body, one timeline, one identity, moving forward through time, accumulating memory, whether it wants to or not. You live with every version of yourself because there is no way to separate them. Life after reality removes that enforcement. When consciousness is no longer bound to a single body or location, identity stops being singular. Memory becomes modular. Personality becomes adjustable. Selves can diverge, specialize, and evolve independently. Experiences no longer have to be permanent. They can be copied, archived, edited, or abandoned. Instead of one irreversible life path, identity becomes a managed system. Different versions of the self can pursue different goals, inhabit different environments, and make different choices without collapsing into conflict. Continuity becomes optional rather than mandatory. You are no longer required to carry every past decision forward. Identity stops being something you endure. It becomes something you curate. And once the self is no longer singular, reality loses another foundational anchor, the assumption that every human experience must belong to one permanent me. Reality creates urgency by making time irreversible. Moments pass once, decisions harden into outcomes, and the body moves steadily toward decay. That pressure forces prioritization. It makes delay costly and action meaningful. Life after reality weakens that mechanism. When aging can be paused, simulated, or detached from biological decline, time stops functioning as a threat. Experiences can be deferred indefinitely. Failure can be reversed. Consequences can be isolated, replayed, or contained within controlled environments. Time no longer pushes forward with authority. It waits. But urgency was never just a limitation. It was a psychological engine. It created momentum. It made choices feel necessary rather than optional. Without it, motivation begins to drift. Desire loses friction. Action no longer feels required, now instead of later. When nothing is running out, everything can wait. And once urgency dissolves, reality loses one of its most powerful forces for shaping human behavior, the pressure of time that cannot be reclaimed. Reality gives meaning through limitation. Effort matters because bodies tire. Resources matter because matter is finite. Achievement matters because not everyone can succeed. Scarcity forces prioritization, and prioritization gives actions weight. Life after reality removes those pressures. When creation becomes computational, resources approach abundance. Skill can be accelerated, simulated, or bypassed entirely. Difficulty is no longer imposed by the world. It becomes a selectable parameter. What once required years of effort can be achieved instantly, duplicated endlessly, or undone without cost. As scarcity dissolves, meaning no longer emerges on its own. Struggle stops being a condition of existence and becomes a design choice. Achievement loses friction. Progress becomes ambiguous. Without limits pushing back, effort risks feeling symbolic rather than necessary. In a world where nothing resists you by default, value cannot be inherited from circumstance. It must be constructed deliberately. And once meaning has to be engineered rather than discovered, reality loses another role it once played effortlessly, the quiet pressure that made human striving feel unavoidable. When meaning no longer emerges from scarcity, it has to be generated intentionally. Life after reality cannot rely on circumstance to produce purpose. Without limitation, there is no automatic struggle. Without struggle, there is no inherited reason to act. To remain psychologically stable, post-reality societies must construct systems that manufacture stakes where none naturally exist. Artificial purpose engines emerge. These are designed environments, rule sets, and narratives built to impose challenge, uncertainty, and consequence. Voluntary constraints replace imposed ones. Difficulty is selected rather than endured. Risk is simulated but emotionally real. Failure is allowed to hurt, even when it no longer has to. People choose limits not because they are trapped, but because friction is required to feel alive. They opt into loss, effort, and resistance as deliberate experiences. Suffering becomes elective. Struggle becomes a feature. In a world where escape is always available, commitment becomes the rarest resource. And purpose survives not by accident, but by design. As existence becomes frictionless, a counterforce appears. Even with artificial purpose engines in place, something still feels missing. Designed challenges simulate struggle, but they do not fully replace the psychological weight of real limitation. When difficulty is optional, commitment weakens. When exit is always available, immersion fractures. So humans begin to reintroduce constraint not as punishment, but as correction. Physical pain, manual effort, irreversibility, scarcity. Environments are deliberately constructed to feel older than the systems that created them. Slower, heavier, less forgiving. Places where actions cannot be undone instantly, where progress requires time, and where mistakes leave marks that cannot be erased with a command. These constraints are chosen, not imposed. In a post-reality world, the primitive returns as therapy. People seek resistance, not because they lack power, but because power without resistance feels unanchored. Limitation becomes grounding. Difficulty becomes stabilizing. Reality, once escaped, is reintroduced in fragments, not because technology failed, but because comfort succeeded too well. Once constraint becomes a choice, humanity stops moving together. Different groups select different realities, different limits, different definitions of what it means to live meaningfully. Some choose heavy constraint physical bodies, irreversible time, permanent consequence. Others choose fluid existence, modular identity, reversible outcomes, near total control. Many move between these states, but they do not experience them in the same way. A shared baseline disappears. Events no longer happen to everyone. What counts as progress in one environment may be irrelevant, invisible, or meaningless in another. Entire populations can coexist without overlapping causality, without shared history, without even agreeing on what qualifies as reality. Civilization fractures not through collapse, but through divergence. Humanity does not split into winners and losers. It splits into incompatible ways of being. And for the first time, there is no single story that can contain them all. Truth requires a shared ground to stand on. For most of human history, disagreement still existed inside a common frame. People argued about meaning, belief, and interpretation, but they argued from within the same reality. Evidence pointed somewhere. Facts resisted preference. The world pushed back. Life after reality removes that pressure. When different populations inhabit different systems with different rules, truth stops being universal. Facts still exist, but relevance becomes local. What is provable in one environment may be unobservable in another. Evidence becomes contextual. Authority becomes conditional. Consensus begins to decay. Truth is no longer something discovered through resistance. It becomes something selected through participation. What matters depends entirely on which reality you occupy and which rules you accept. Shared narratives fragment because there is no longer a shared world to anchor them. Humanity does not lose truth. It loses a single version of it. And once truth stops being collective, the idea of a common future begins to dissolve with it. When reality no longer enforces a single truth, it also removes a familiar escape. For most of human history, responsibility could be displaced. Fate, biology, circumstance, society, even the universe itself could be blamed. Limits existed outside the individual, and those limits absorbed guilt, failure, and regret. Life after reality dismantles that shelter. When you choose your environment, your constraints, your identity, and your rules, outcomes stop being accidental. There is no system left to blame for how things unfold. Every consequence traces back to a decision that was made or a difficulty that was refused. Freedom expands, but so does accountability. There is no longer a default world forcing you into action or holding you back. There is only the reality you selected and the version of yourself you chose to inhabit within it. Even inaction becomes a choice with authorship attached. Existence shifts from survival to responsibility. And when nothing compels you from the outside, the burden of meaning, failure, and direction collapses inward, onto the self that decided to live this way. Life after reality is not defined by technology. It is defined by choice. When nothing is enforced, not bodies, not time, not scarcity, not truth, what remains is what humanity decides to preserve. Values no longer survive because they are necessary. Struggles no longer persist because they are unavoidable. Everything that continues does so by selection alone. Some versions of humanity will choose ease. Others will choose difficulty. Some will preserve identity. Others will fragment it. Some will cling to truth as coherence. Others will abandon it for meaning. None of these paths are inevitable. None are guaranteed. Reality once shaped humanity through force. After reality, shaping becomes voluntary. What survives will not be what is most efficient, most comfortable, or most advanced. It will be what people are willing to recommit to when nothing compels them to do so. What remains will not be inherited from the world. It will be authored. And in that future, humanity is no longer defined by the reality it escaped, but by the values it chose to carry forward when escape was complete.